this way, so get your pictures ready, get your video ready. Let's welcome on one of our volunteers, a former head of year in the education world. You'll know that when you hear his voice, because he sounds like a teacher. Every time I hear his voice, a little tingle goes up my spine. It is Tim Broad. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Steve. The theme of this display is changing tactics. And you'll remember, David has just told you that between the wars, America had literally a handful of light tanks and combat cars. They really didn't expect to fight either the Canadians or the Mexicans anytime soon. When France fell in 1940, they woke up to the impending threat of fascism and very quickly swung into action producing armoured vehicles. Now, the one we have here is the M5A1. It wasn't the first American tank to see combat. The first American tank was the M3, but essentially the M5 is an upgraded M3. The M3 was a development of an existing light tank, rushed into service. The British had it in North Africa. They liked it because it was reliable, it was quick. They called it the Honey. But they didn't like the lack of protection and the relatively small gun. Now, the gun you can see on there is the standard American anti-tank gun, 37mm. This is what the Americans thought would be a successful tank killer. Even by 1942, that was becoming obsolescent. But nevertheless, they rushed these tanks into production and started to upgrade them to produce this, the M5, slightly bigger turret, slightly bigger hull because they changed the engine. They rejected the Continental Radial Aero engine, which they had been using in the M3. That was a big, tall engine. Got rid of that, put a couple of twin Cadillacs in there, and produced the M5 Stuart. Now, the Stuart was undergunned. This tank isn't undergunned. This is the replacement for the Stuart. This is the M24 Chappie, specifically designed as a light tank, and specifically designed to meet some of the criticisms that the Stuarts had been subject to, in particular the firepower. Now that gun on there is a 75mm. I'm sure David would explain basically the hole, the size of the hole that you look down when you look down the barrel. Not designed for a tank. It was originally designed for an aeroplane, the B-25 Mitchell bomber. The Americans were very concerned about the size of the Japanese fleet in the Pacific, so they wanted some kind of ship-busting, long-range aircraft. They were going to fit these 75mm underneath a Mitchell bomber. Wasn't a great success as an idea. A number were made, but it meant that there was a load of surplus guns available they could put into their new light tank. It's got the same twin Cadillacs that we see in the Stuarts. It's lightly armoured. The spec said they wanted it round about 20 to 25 tons. So that meant you had to limit the thickness of the armour, and that was the main criticism from the crew, that this tank, loved the firepower, it's still relatively underprotected, particularly from mines. Now you'll notice that this was in British colours. A relatively small number were provided for the British Army, and interestingly, the 7th Armoured Dig, the so-called Desert Rats, who had been using Stuart M3 and M5s for their reconnaissance tanks, because by the middle of the war, those light tanks were becoming pretty useless when facing these heavier German vehicles. They replaced their M3s and M5s with the M24 Chappie. Had a long service life. It fought in Korea, for instance. They were shipped from Japan into Korea at the start of the Korean War. Didn't fare desperately well against the Chinese-manned Russian T-34-85s. They were outgunned. It was only really when the British Centurions turned up where we began to get that armour balance back in our favour in Korea. They fought in what was then called Indochina, French Indochina, when the French were trying to fight the Viet Minh, and famously the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Bits of Chappies were parachuted onto the battlefield, reassembled in situ, and fought on the ground to try and defend the French positions there. The French lost, and not one of the Chappies came out of that battle in one piece. So you can see that we've got this concept of the light tank And it was largely intended for reconnaissance, patrol work, wasn't really intended to fight as an exploitative tank. What the Americans really wanted to build was a medium tank. They couldn't do it easily in 1940. They came up with the interim solution, the M3 Grant, where they were trying to shoehorn a 75mm gun into a tank chassis. The Grant had a lot of good things in its favour, but equally it was about the size of a small house. Not an easy thing to hide, particularly in the desert where the British first used them. However, Rommel didn't like them because it allowed the British to engage his anti-tank guns at range. And remember, most tanks are not taken by anti-tank guns, not by other tanks. This is the medium tank they really wanted to build. It came online in time for the Battle of Alamein, 1942. This is the M1A1 Sherman. Quite possibly, the Sherman marked the most important Allied tank in World War II. The Russians might argue that the T-34 was, but this tank, the sheer volume of its production, throughout World War II, the Americans managed to produce 50,000 Shermans, very nearly 50,000 Shermans. In World War II, the Germans produced 6,000 Panthers. Right? Every single heavy engineering company in America was producing Sherman tanks. This one was produced by the Lima Locomotive Company. It's got a cast hull, that rounded cast hull, very, very strong. Because Lima was used to dealing with big engines, big locomotives, they had the capacity to do this. Not all of the others did. Ford Bridges wasn't used to that kind of thing. They tended to use welded and bolted construction. You'll notice, if you look very closely at Havoc, she's got what's known as applique armour attached to the outside, around the front of the hull, of the turret, and on the side of the hull. That was to answer one of the major criticisms of the early marks of Sherman, that they were prone to being penetrated and prone to fire. That was partly to do with poor ammunition storage, which was put right in later marks, and of course by adding extra armour, PK armour on the outside. The other major criticism was that the gun, the 75mm there, was perfectly adequate in 1942. In fact, the Shermans at Alamein were easily the equal of any tank the Germans could field at the time. By 1944, things had changed. We've got Mark IV Specials with a long 75mm gun. We've got Panthers. We've got Tigers. We need a bigger gun. And here's a bigger gun. This is the M4A2. M4A2 bracket 76 closed bracket. This, of course, is Fury. You'll recognise it from the film. The interesting thing is that the tanks tend to be, the various types of German tank tend to be designated by the engines in the back of them. And that depends on who made them. Right? So this particular one has twin diesels. So he's pointing his machine gun at me for some reason. This particular one has twin diesels, right? Not as was portrayed in the film. It's got a petrol engine, it's got a diesel engine. But it's got a much improved gun, the 76mm, higher velocity, able to penetrate more enemy armour. This particular one has also got the more advanced suspension units, which became typical in the later versions of the Sherman. It's kind of confusing when you look at the story of the Sherman, because each particular mark continued to be made by whoever was making it. So the A1s were still being produced towards the end of the war. It wasn't the case of A1, A2, A3, A4, I think simple like that. Right? And in fact, you see them both moving off there, we were able to use our A2 to represent an A3 Easy 8 for the film Fury, because it had got many of the adaptations that became standard on the A3. There is no running A3 available. There was no running A3 available. So our A2 stood in for the Easy 8. There was the Sherman Atomic Hooker, or Ronson, as the British tended to call it. Yeah, the early ones did have this problem. They had a problem of open ammunition stowage. If they were penetrated, that ammo would blow. There was also a slight problem with the fuel storage as well. And the important thing is that they were never really intended to be a heavy tank. They were never intended to go toe-to-toe with heavy German tanks. That's an exploitative vehicle. Punch a hole in the enemy line, generally, think of the time with artillery and what have you, you feed in your fast, exploitative tanks who then rampage around in the rear of the German. This is what this is designed to do. If you do 20 miles an hour across country, that's pretty good. That's pretty good for a tank of its size. Its weight and armour was limited by the Americans, who wanted to keep it down to around about 30 tons so they could ship it easily. So you couldn't up-armour it terribly well. Your Lotus Fury here has got wooden batons along the side. People often imagine that's for getting it out, but it's not. It's to defeat hollow-charged German anti-tank rockets like the Panzerschreck, right, which will explode on the outside of the wood. Easy to replace the wood, less easy to replace the tank and the crew. What did they got in his favour? And bear in mind, they worked hard to deal with these deficiencies. They upgraded the gun, they put wet stowage in or damp stowage in for later models so that the ammunition didn't fire so much. What it had in its favour was it was incredibly mechanically reliable. And perhaps the most important thing the Schumann had going for it, there was always another one. Now, I'm going to pass on to my colleague David, who's going to take on another icon of World War II.
Great opportunity here to see, we've got a T-34-85 coming on, almost a Russian equivalent of the Sherman. Mass production, huge numbers, and of course the Russians, they're looking at tanks and artillery, that's it. They don't give a monkeys about their Navy, their Air Force. They are just going to make an enormous amount of artillery shells, tubes to launch those artillery shells, and tanks. That's going to be the Russian way of war. Now the T-34-85, this is the one with a bigger turret, 85mm gun, starts the war with a 76mm gun on it. Still bigger than anything the Germans have, and most of the rest of Europe as well. A guy called Koshkin gets the design in front of Stalin in the later 1930s. The Red Army aren't that bothered. There's rivalry still in Russia. The Red Army's already just decided they're going to have the KV-1 tank, big heavy tank, 76mm gun. Do we really want this one? But Stalin, being a dictator, just as we'll see in a moment how Hitler influenced his tank design, Stalin basically leads forward, coughs politely and says, I think you ought to have this. Yes, comrade Stalin. So on it goes into production. Troublesome beginning for the Russians. They had to buy in British tanks to copy. They bought in the American Christie tanks in 1930. They're getting there with their production. Building enormous factories, using tank production as part of their 5-year plan to industrialise the country. The T-34, it's there ready in 1941 when Germany invades. Germany, again, at that period, has had a pact with Stalin. They're pals at the time. When the Germans come over the border, the Russians have just gone through a major purge. Stalin has killed 30,000 officers. So you've got this huge army, but very little in the way of effective leadership. And when the Germans, for their advantage, first meet the T-34, they say, you know, not very well organised, running around the place. They don't have radios. They're looking for targets, etc. So there is a tendency, perhaps, to think the T-34, what a great design, isn't it brilliant, etc. More T-34s are knocked out than any other tank in World War II. But that doesn't matter for the Russians, because they see it like we would a hand grenade. If you need a certain number of T-34s to get to A to B on the battlefield, there they are, and we'll get another load for you when you've got to B. So they really see this as a munition that's going to be disposable. At one point, they reckon a T-34 will be in combat 6 weeks before it gets knocked out. So as long as we've got those thousands and thousands and tens of thousands coming, they can supply that as part of their battle technique, how they're going to fight, their doctrine. And the other thing about the T-34, it is not just a crude lump, it's part of a bigger system the Russians have got. How they're going to attack, how many shells are going to be needed before we're going to get that breakthrough. So actually by 1945, the Russian system of how they're fighting is much more sophisticated than just pure numbers. But a fantastically important bit of kit in World War II. They were going to redesign a new tank, T-44, after the Battle of Kursk. They decided against it. Let's just improve the T-34 with a bigger turret, bigger gun. Why was it they needed? At Kursk, they meet for the first time the Panther, the Tiger I, and the Elephant. So that heavy German armour has got an enormous effect. And we're very privileged, obviously, here today to see a King Tiger, the only running King Tiger. It's come all the way from Samur. Many thanks to World of Tanks paying for this, making it happen that way. This is the second model of Tiger tank. It's developed almost at the same time as the Tiger I, but it takes longer. And that's because Hitler has said in May of 1941, I want you to put the long-barreled L-71 88mm gun on a tank. And first of all, everyone says, can't be done, sir. Hence Tiger I with a shorter barrel. This is the one that Hitler really wanted. Another dictator, if he says something, it happens in the end. Now, just like with the Tiger I, there's the HWA, the German Weapons Office. They get two companies to bid for the production. Krupp, the arms manufacturer, makes the turret, nothing to do with the designers, that way they design their own one. Henschel and Ferdinand Porsche's consortium, or his company, both put in bids. Porsche, he's got the ear of Hitler, but most of his military designs in World War II, apart from the Kugelwagen and mainly the Shipwagen, are pretty useless because he overspecs and complicates things. He wants this vehicle to be petrol-electric drive. They've already had trouble with that with the Tiger I, doesn't work for them, and Germans are really wary about that. It needs copper for the electric motors, they haven't got that much, etc. So it's Henschel that gets the design going. And forgive us if you've heard this all the time, but here we have a pre-production Tiger II, and it's got that turret that was erroneously called for many years the Porsche turret. Porsche had nothing to do with it. Krupp designs it, they realise it's overcomplicated, it's got what they call a shot track. So this production turret is what goes on the main production tanks. First 50 of them have the earlier turret. And why that was a problem was you had to bend the metal, there was cracks in the metal, etc. This one's simpler to build. And even the Germans, even though they've got this beautiful engineering, complex issues, etc. they're doing, even they realise, with Albert Speer coming as production minister, simplify where you can. Speer is trying to persuade Hitler all the time. Are you honestly sure you need something this big, sir? And we get obviously enamoured. Boy, isn't it impressive? That huge size of gun. The thickness of the armour, never penetrated on the front by any Allied tank, it looks like, in World War II. 2,000-3,000 metres, if you're hit by one of the armour-piercing rounds, nothing's going to survive that on the Western battlefields in tank terms. So it is very, very impressive. Downside, they can't simply make enough of them. And in October of 1944, the Henschel factory in Germany is bombed, and it really causes trouble for production. They end up losing, they give up on the idea of the Maus, the famous even bigger tank the Germans were going to build. That's abandoned, and production of the King Tiger, it ends up being limited about 490 odd by the end of the war. Again, something that we're looking at, 68 tons, what a problem you've got, because again, that's going to be a tank that has teething issues. How do we get it from A to B? Transport tracks, just like the Tiger one. You take the big outer road wheels off, thinner tracks so it can go on the railway, etc. So always going to be an issue there. So even though it is undoubtedly a technological achievement, very, very big and impressive, it certainly does not really help the Germans win the war. And you probably read, a lot of people say probably were destroyed by their own crews because they broke down, but ever were knocked out by the enemy in combat. Now, one thing we can uniquely do here now today at the Tank Museum is show you Tiger, there's Tiger 2, Royal Tiger sometimes, King Tiger, as it was called, and there's our famous Tiger 131, the earlier model, and there they are coming in the arena together, and I'll shut up just for a moment so you can listen to those and see them go by.
Panzer IV at the back. Panzer IV.
So if you just think there, Panzer III first started design for the German military way back in 1934. They have an issue, the Germans, building these tanks, getting the technology right. They're only just coming into service. They reckon the German military says we'll be ready in about 42, 43, Hitler jumps the gun. And so they're going into combat. This one has got, it starts the Panzer III, the one at the rear there, starts with a 37mm anti-tank gun. That's what you see in France mainly. This is the next model, 5cm gun. They've upped the armour on the front. This particular one was sent out to North Africa to fight there. It was captured by Britain and brought back for evaluation. But if you look at that tank, the specs of it, and then the fact Hitler comes along and says, no, early on, I want you to put an enormous 88mm gun on a tank. It's going to have 10 centimetres thick armour. He's made this enormous leap forward that the German military doesn't really want, but has to follow. And so you don't want to give Hitler credit, but of course the guns versus armour race is what World War II tanks seem to be about. So he seems to have got that right in one way, if you give him credit for that. So that leads to the Tiger 1. When you look at them, underneath, very similar designs, turret on the top, driver in the front, nothing radical about the differences there, just the scale. But the problem is once you're building at scale, have we got an engine? Have we got components that can really deal with that sort of weight? So again, you'll have heard with Tiger 1s and certainly Tiger 2s as well, lots of early trouble with seals, with transmissions, with gearboxes, trying to cope with that extra weight there. But a really impressive lineup of the generational difference there. Of the early war, what the Germans were fighting with in 41, 42, then later in 42, the very first Tiger 1 comes out, sees service out on the Leningrad front, at the insistence of Hitler, by the way, in a place on the battlefield. The soldiers are saying, don't go there, it's all rocky ground. No, you have to go there. So the first Tigers get lost on the eastern front, bogged down. We meet the Tiger in Tunisia. Spare Panzer Battalion 504, that's where 131 comes from. And of course the story behind that one is brought back to Britain for evaluation. The French Royal Tiger, or King Tiger, has got a very interesting story behind it. Again, at the end of the Second World War, if you're in France, what do? You scrap any of the enemy stuff. They put some Panthers to use in the reformed French army. This tank, composite of two German tanks, is put in a store by the French tank manufacturer, and it's kept out of the way. It's only in the mid-70s that finally they dig it out the back of the shed. It was really early days, let's use it for a bit of analysis, nothing much happens, and it ends up being sent to the French Tank Museum at Saumur. It's on the Loire River, lovely spot to visit. And so the French have got this one going. It's got Maybach HL230 engine in the back. You're listening to the real thing there. Originally it had a different paint scheme. It was painted in the colours. The guy who ran the French Tank Museum in the 70s was Colonel Aubrey. He was knocked out in a Sherman when he was fighting in World War II by a King Tiger. So he painted it, or had it painted, by the King Tiger that knocked him out. And it looked like that for many. They've repainted it, and go and have a closer look at it when it's over there in during the break over lunchtime. But an amazing opportunity to see those tanks together there. Those, well, really the height of tank design at the end of the war, but not, we might argue, the right tank design. Every time one of those, the production costs, the hours involved, the energy of the design, etc., would the Germans be better off making a few more Sturmgeschützes, like that Panzer III at the end, but without, don't bother about turret, too much complexity, just put a casement on the top with a gun in, that'll take out. And in Normandy, Sturmgeschützes take out more Allied armour than any other model of tank. So again, from that point of view, you know, do you have plenty simple designs like the Sherman, like the T-34? Germany just couldn't make those numbers anyway. So big debate: were they right to go for high end, or should they have spread their load a little bit more? From our point of view, probably a good job Hitler was involved in the process, because basically for the German army, he cocked it up for them, you know, and he's designed that way, insisting all the time on high-tech weaponry, lots of experimentation, fascinating for us as military historians, not necessarily the right thing for the German military at the time. So there goes our King Tigers going off, our Tiger One, they'll be over there to park up, go and have a look at them. Just remember, if you go in that tank park over lunchtime, some of those exhausts might be a bit hot. Talk to the crews, talk to the guys that were restoring, driving them. Well, amazing, we've lost a generation pretty much that actually did all this. So these people are getting pretty unique experiences, what it's like to drive these various bits of kit here. So we'll see the Sherman and the T-34 off as well, and they'll run around. And again, after lunch, we're going to be seeing some of these tanks back again, including that King Tiger and our Tiger One, in a bit of a scenario for you. So you'll be able to see that again a little bit later on from 2 o'clock in the arena there. Just seeing back the Tiger One, as you see there over in the far corner. Driver, of course, that lovely phrase, going to war looking out of the letterbox. Very small vision from the front there when you're actually driving a closed down tank.